Good morning, beautiful people. This is Pastor Eric, Associate Pastor at Lyndhurst Baptist Church on the west side of Indy, and Indiana State Chaplain for Broken Chains JC, with the encouraging word for Thursday, January 15th. And so today we are reading a section from the Day by Day with the Church Fathers devotional, and it is entitled Rich Fools, and it was written by Thascius Cyprianus, also known as Cyprian, an early church father who lived in the 3rd century, was born in 210 and died in 258. And so the scripture verse for today is 1 Timothy 6:9. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. And so Scripture has a lot of things to say about the rich, and which seems very counterculture, because in this day and age we tend to venerate and we tend to lift up people that we consider to be good businessmen, men who know how to make bank, as they say. But Scripture has some things to say. Proverbs 22:16, whoever oppresses the poor to increase his own wealth, or give to the rich, will only come to poverty. Proverbs 11:14, riches do not profit in the day of death, but righteousness delivers from death. And again in Proverbs 22, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver and gold. We know that Jesus shared in one of his parables that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And there are many, many, many more sections in Scripture that have things to say about riches. Riches, wealth, worldly wealth can be a snare. That's what 1 Timothy talks about. And he goes on in verse 10 of that 1 Timothy chapter 6, that the love of money, for the love of money, not money itself, but the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. So, yes, there are some things to be said there. Cyprian writes, Jesus teaches us not only that riches are to be despised, but they are also full of danger. They are the root of seducing evils and deceive the blind human mind by hidden deception. God rebukes rich fools who think only of their earthly wealth and boast in the abundance of their overflowing harvests. I'm going to read that line again. God rebukes rich fools who think only of their earthly wealth and boast in the abundance of their overflowing harvest. He says, he being God, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall those things be which thou hast provided? The fool was rejoicing in his supplies when he would die that very night. One whose life was already failing was thinking about the abundance of his food. However, the Lord tells us that those who sell all their possessions and distribute them for the poor become perfect and complete. In doing so, they lay up treasures for themselves in heaven. He says that those who follow him and aren't entangled by worldly possessions accompany their possessions which they send to God. For such a reward, let us all prepare ourselves, learn to pray, and discern from our prayers what we should become. For he promises that all things will be added to those who seek God's kingdom and righteousness. And so, oh man, boy, that's a challenging one, isn't it? what are the treasures that we are seeking today? You know, so much of kingdom values are counterculture, and probably it would be helpful to do a series on kingdom values at some point in time. And one of the ways that we see that so starkly is in this idea of worldly possessions and wealth and riches. And, you know, again, in our world, we tend to lift up and celebrate and venerate those people that are good businessmen. We want them running our companies. We want them being in the government, that kind of thing. And yet, Jesus taught, and not just it's not just found in the Gospels or in the writings of Paul's, but it's also found in the Old Testament. These continual warnings against wealth, and not that there is anything wrong with money in and of itself. We need money to survive, right? Bills have to be paid. Utilities have to be paid. Good wishes aren't going to do it. But this idea of making the acquirement of wealth as kind of our aim in life. You know, he who has the most toys win. And Scripture would say that is just nothing but vanity. It's an empty pursuit that ultimately doesn't come to anything it doesn't fulfill, and ultimately brings with it bondage. Because the more you have, the more concerned you become about keeping what you have. Whereas Jesus talks about a life of giving away, selling all of your possessions, giving to the poor. That we're building up treasure, but the treasure that we're building up is found in heaven, not necessarily earthly treasure. So, today, as we live our life, let us make sure that the treasures that we seek are eternal in nature. And that if we have been in a position where God has blessed us with a certain amount of abundance, and to be honest, for all of us who live in America, we are the 1% of the world, even those of us who are struggling mightily, and there are a lot of us out there in this day and age, but compared to so much of the overwhelming majority of the rest of the world, we really are the 1%. And so let us make sure that we are using those earthly treasures that God has blessed us with to further his kingdom, God's kingdom. That we are not living our life in service of worldly treasure, but rather we are allowing our worldly treasure to be used in service of God's kingdom. I'm Pastor Eric, and that is your encouraging word for today.